Hello, welcome to the Jargon Podcast. This is Bill Aimone, and I'm here with our special guest, our Trinergy consultant, Lauren Conces. Welcome, Lauren.
Hey, Bill. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So today we're going to talk about protecting IT assets that have a significant impact on companies and their ability to perform operations. So, the first thing that comes to my mind is what happened with Southwest Airlines. They use this word technical debt, or they're talking about their information technology infrastructure being really old and how it basically shut them down for a few days, hurt their stock price, hurt their reputation in the market. And, one bad, I'll call it, incident like that can really hurt the reputation of a company. And just like with anybody, it's very difficult to maintain a reputation when something like that happens. But Lauren, you've been working with some fairly large companies that are in infrastructure, energy space, and everything where it's critical for them to keep operations up and running. And so today I'm going to be talking to Lauren and getting some insight on some things companies are doing to be proactive about making sure their assets are up to date and everything. So Lauren, I heard you use the word technical debt one time real quickly, and what does that mean, like to a 2-year-old, basically?
Sure. It's kind of a word. I think it's gaining popularity and kind of something IT has been using to get funding from the business and saying, we have all this technical debt we need to address. It's kind of a buzzword within IT now. But what it really means is basically a bunch of accrued issues over a period of time resulting from management decisions or poorly executed, rushed IT projects. Kind of some examples of this might be configurations or code that's no longer in use, technical shortcuts that were made to meet project delivery time requirements. And then when we think about like infrastructure, a lot of what you were saying, Bill, around end of life, end of support technology. You can also look at vulnerabilities and incidents, kind of like the risk associated with it. So it's a broad term, but I think it really helps define where the risk is within IT.
So basically what you're getting at is, if put it in easy terms for me, like if I had a car and I really didn't change the oil much, or maybe I put in inexpensive parts to replace something. Basically, that car, at any point, that car could break down, and I'm stuck on the side of the highway. So that's what a lot of organizations may do. And maybe it's to save money. Maybe it's to get something released quickly so they don't have to miss deadlines. And so they may have a product out there that maybe isn't perfect. But isn't it also the case, too, that technology just gets outdated because they're having to interact with newer technologies like my phone? I can't get onto some old mainframe application on my phone, right? So you've got that component of too. Is that kind of part of it too?
Yeah, a big part of it is, especially when you think about applications versus infrastructure, a lot of times companies will have technical debt within their infrastructure because of older applications that the business wants to use. They need that functionality, but it can only run on older servers or older storage devices, what have you, that are completely out of support. And when things are just, in general, when things are out of support, they can't receive the patches they need. There's a lot of vulnerabilities that are found on those types of systems. So it's a compiling issue.
Okay, but if I'm a business executive and I'm sitting there listening to all that, it just sounds intimidating to me. So how can an IT organization begin to address this? Because fundamentally, a lot of them probably know they have issues and holes, but what's the first step to even start to figure out, okay, what should we be doing about this?
Right. I think the first step is, first of all, knowing what you have, having a good inventory of your IT assets, tracking the metadata around it, what type of operating systems are in use, what year they go out of support, just having that basic inventory. And then kind of from there, you can figure out, okay, where's our biggest areas of technical debt, and then how do we prioritize our projects to go address it accordingly.
Okay, wait a minute. Now, you said something very basic, have an inventory. Doesn't every company have an inventory of all their systems just right there?
Yeah. That's something, you would think, you would assume, especially with some of these really large, mature companies that have been around for 60 plus years. But what we found is, especially if companies have recently adopted a CMDB or
CMDB. Tell me what that is.
Okay. So it's a configuration management database, basically a fancy word for how we store data around inventory. There's, can be used as in a lot of different ways, but usually they're found in like IT service management tools.
Okay, so basically it's all your configurations and everything that you've built. So it's not just the software you have, but everything the software you've built,
Yep.
any configurations you've done, and kind of managing that.
Yep.
Okay.
It helps you keep track of your inventory. So if companies have newly deployed a CMDB, or if they're going through any sort of transition, a lot of times they're missing basic data around their assets. And it's a big problem we've seen at companies, especially with things like auto discovery of tools, fixing discovery rules. And it's a lot more prevalent of an issue than you would think.
Okay, so you developed this inventory. How do you go about doing that? I mean, where do you even begin?
Usually larger IT departments will have an asset management program, but regardless of that, I think any company should make sure that the people who are over these assets, so your service delivery managers, your IT supervisors, whoever is the designated leadership, really owns these assets, and they're ultimately accountable for making sure that all of their inventory is tracked, and if changes happen, if things are decommissioned or commissioned, they're brought into that inventory set. So it's another buzzword, but asset management is a big practice and a very crucial for maintaining that inventory set.
Okay, so basically what you're getting at, you need to have some good, robust asset management processes in place to manage your assets, keep them up to date, track them. So you would track them typically like in an IT service management application. I guess you're talking about like a ServiceNow or
Yep.
Okay, Avante
Or Chairwell. Yep.
Okay, got it. So then what do you do? So you've got all these assets and you've got, okay, I've got everything we have, everything we own. How do you then kind of translate that? How do you figure out, okay, what's important, what's not, what should we be addressing, what's critical, what's not? What do you do?
Yeah, so once you kind of have your basic data set, you figure out what data is available, what's reliable, what's comprehensive enough to use. You can figure out how to leverage that data to figure out where your main areas of risk are. And kind of when I think of, okay, how do I go about assessing technical debt, I think of two things. I think of risk and also impact to the business. So those are two things you kind of want to weigh against each other. On the risk side, how many vulnerabilities and incidents are these assets building up? If these are things your company does track. What is the supportability levels? Does it have really high O&M costs? What's the cost if things break? And then on the business impact side, you really want to look at how critical an asset is. A lot of times IT departments will have criticality ratings per asset. If something's externally facing, if there's direct impact on the customer, the business, if it goes down, that should be
like a
rated
reservation system for an airline.
Exactly.
Externally facing, or
Yep.
something that's monitoring vehicles out in the field that are going in and supporting customers, or something that's mission critical.
Right.
Okay.
And so those are the assets that you want to make sure are taken care of first. Those should really take priority based off, there's a bunch of different things you can look at. But once you figure out what data you have available, figure out how you want to leverage it to determine risk and impact. And then you can take that and say, okay, where are key areas of risk? And then how do we go about addressing that with, IT funded initiatives?
So that risk piece, who are the type of people in the organization you have to engage as part of the process? Who needs to be involved in that?
Right. Typically, anyone who is familiar with the data set, first of all, who's familiar with the assets, the people who actually own the assets, like I mentioned, they could be, like I said, service delivery managers, IT supervisors, whoever in your organization owns that data and those assets. You want to talk to them. You also want to talk to enterprise architects, because usually they have a pretty big picture of all the different things happening within IT, and a lot of times they're helpful in developing, the roadmap. So you would want to engage them as well.
Okay. So once you've done this, I'll call it risk assessment, if I'm using the right kind of framing of this, then it sounds like to me, I've updated my asset management portfolio, my configuration management database, and then you've done a risk assessment across all these different applications. And you also mentioned the infrastructure side of it too. So it's not just software, it's also the hardware.
Right.
So your network, your your servers that you have in a data center and that type of thing. Do you also want to include some of your cloud-based software as well?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so that's part of it. So
Yep.
you really want to include everything.
You really want to look at everything, and a lot of times it's a little difficult to think of I guess, to evaluate risk levels on different assets in the same way. So, for example, if you're looking at the amount of incidents with risk, sometimes, certain devices will have more incidents than others just because of the way that incidents are tracked within that system. So you really want to make sure you know all those details of what goes behind that data so you can make the right assumptions.
Okay, so you basically need to look at history of maybe downtime or maybe even breaches of security on those assets, and really look at that to maybe say, look, this particular asset has gone down X percent of time versus another one, so that might move it up in the prioritization because it's at more risk, or maybe it has some vulnerability because it's on the network and it's got some exposure to even a gateway where someone can hack through that and protect those pieces of it. But then you're also getting at too is the network itself. Is that kind of part of this as well?
Yeah, the network itself is also another component. Everything works together. So a lot of times if there's an issue with one part of, somewhere within your architecture, it could be caused by something else down the line. So I think kind of another point is making sure you understand the relationships within your environment, so how things interact. So if something breaks, it might not be an issue on that device. It might be something upstream that affected it.
So basically you've got to trace back to the impacts. You might say this piece of hardware supports this other piece of hardware, supports another one, which then supports something mission critical. So you almost have to do some sort of mapping of everything to say, here's the cause and effect down the road. But then do you also need to think about the people and the resources and where they're deployed as well? How does that come into play? Is that a little more softer and difficult to do? Or, how does that fall into that?
I think so. I think when you think about how it impacts the business, or at least from a cost perspective, some assets require higher levels of support. So when you're looking at technical debt, this is kind of, since it is a loosely defined term, I think we can use it in this case. But
you can use whatever term you want.
Yeah, whatever term you want. Yeah. But if something does have a lot of money going into it, it's something you want to focus on, before you look at the other things that you're not really spending a lot of money on. So that's just one more factor, is the resources and costs going into
what it's costing to support it, and then probably even future upgrades that are coming up that you've got to do. You got to think about that and the cost of that. This gets pretty complicated.
It does.
So you've got to coordinate all this, pull it all together, and I think where does this all come together? Is this part of the CMDB? Is that kind of what you're referring to, or is this something different?
No. So companies can determine how they want to assess risk and impact on their own. Something we've done with Trinergy with other clients is creating a scoring methodology that's objective and database that kind of puts a specific asset on a scale from, 1 to 10 of where it falls risk and impact wise. But I think with the CMDB, it's more just tracking the assets. That's where you're going to get a lot of your data.
Okay, so essentially what you're saying, there's kind of, I'll call it a risk scorecard that you can do and pull all that together. And then you've got your assets, you've got where's the criticality, here's the risk impact of it, and which ones do we want to focus on first, second, third.
Yep.
So that process of prioritization, tell me a little bit about that and kind of how that works and just some things you've seen.
So you obviously want to focus on the things with the highest risk first. You have to take into account, the cost of that, kind of what the overarching IT strategy is, and make sure it aligns with that. In an ideal world, IT strategy would be built around this prioritization process, but sometimes that's not the case, and it's kind of an afterthought.
So you might have to go redo your IT strategy, is what you're getting at.
Yeah, sometimes it does come down to that. In a lot of IT programs, they'll have a certain dollar amount that they can use per year to go and upgrade databases, go upgrade, Windows servers, Linux servers. But, if it's only a restricted amount, where the kind of the scoring methodology is, if you're able to prioritize your assets, your exact assets, which of your top 50 Windows servers you need to go address first. So if you only have a set amount of dollars to go upgrade Windows servers, which ones you need to knock out first. So it kind of this scoring methodology that we're talking about really helps with the prioritization of kind of bucketed projects, I want to call, or programs.
But Lauren, wouldn't it also mean that they might need to go back and look at their budget process and update their budget and get some more money? Because, again, I'm thinking about what happened with Southwest Airlines. Maybe they didn't have the budget to do it,
Yep.
and they made the assumption, and I don't know, but they could have made the assumption, oh, we don't have in the budget, so we can't do it. But if you've gone through this whole, I'll call it risk-based approach and looking at it from an enterprise risk perspective, what you're essentially getting at is then you can build a business case to saying, hey, we need to spend $5 more million to then get these assets up to either make the changes we need to update them or replace.
Yep.
Because it's mission critical.
Exactly. And that's also where, service mapping and understanding the relationships between what the business sees on the outside and then what all these underlying things within IT. I think that's where it becomes critical, so you can better communicate to the business, hey, if we don't upgrade this within infrastructure, these applications are going to go down. And they care about the applications, and they'll, fund the applications that support their business operations, but not always do they have the big picture when it comes to IT.
Okay, so Lauren, you just used the word service mapping. Mm-hmm. That's another jargony word, it sounds like.
Gotcha.
All right,
yeah.
So Lauren, what is that? What do we mean by service mapping?
Yep. This is kind of what we were talking about earlier with the relationship mapping, just understanding, what is hosted on what is, containerized, what databases interact with what applications, just knowing all of those relationships. I kind of think of IT as a web sometimes, and everything's connected for the most part.
Well, you hope it's connected,
You
right?
hope it's
If it's not connected, it might not be
connected.
working.
Yeah, exactly.
So the service mapping piece is basically drawing all those connections to say what impacts other pieces of it that brings that service to the, I'll say the end customer of IT in that organization. Okay, got it. So you go through the service mapping exercise. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done probably in the background. It sounds like more than just, hey, let's create an inventory, let's go risk assessment, but you need to have all these other practices in place so that you can have an effective risk management process, because if you don't know how these things are connected, you're just guessing.
And a lot of the data, when we talk about the risk management scoring or whatever methodology you use, a lot of the data that feeds that will come from these background processes, these asset management processes, service mapping. So I think all of that helps kind of in the background.
Okay, so you've done this risk assessment, you've done some prioritization. What happens next typically?
Typically, this is when, you build out a proposed roadmap. What I've seen a lot with clients, and I know both you and Peter have as well, is IT they know what kind of the issues are, and they'll be able to say, oh, we need a roadmap item for this, this, and this, but they won't be able to quantify it, and they won't be able to say what exactly the impact to the business is.
So probably more of a putting it in quantitative terms and level setting so that you can kind of look at everything all at once. They probably intuitively know that these assets are at risk because they're old and they walk by the server and it's all dusty and it makes a lot of noise, and sometimes they have to unplug it and plug it back in. But what you're essentially doing is you're presenting an organized way with some data behind it that says, here's our risk, here's the data, here are the things we need to do. We've done a thorough inventory. To me, the confidence that, after you go through this process that you have is this wasn't just ad hoc. This isn't just going, I think that server is old and I think that one is.
Yep.
Well, it's old, but we don't use it anymore, that type of thing. But you've done a comprehensive look, and it gives business confidence, I think, it sounds like, that, hey, they've looked at everything. They're going to come back to me next year with something else. And I think that's the biggest thing I hear from executives is every year it's something new with IT. This thing, and this thing. And there's things that are unpredictable that'll happen, but this almost really prevents the concept of surprises.
Exactly.
Not 100%, but it gives you a management of confidence that, hey, we know what all the risks are. Here's what we're going to address this year. We're going to address next year. And maybe even, do you provide options, though, too, as part of this?
You can.
Because I'm just thinking, you might say, we've got some mission critical stuff over here, but this part of the business is growing. We need to address these first because we're going to hit some scalability issues somewhere else. Or I'm just...
Right. I think sometimes, like when you're looking to address technical debt, it's not just, okay, we're going to go upgrade all of these operating systems. It's, thinking about it bigger picture. Do we want to standardize our technology? Do we want to migrate all servers to the standard platform to make it easier on us to upgrade everything together and keep track of where things are at? So it can get bigger picture than that. Do we want to move to virtualized machines? There's other kind of questions you need to ask as opposed to just, okay, let's fix this technical debt right here. It's more so looking ahead. Where do we want to be, 5-10 years down the line?
Okay, that makes sense. So really, it's almost kind of not just saying we got to replace this or upgrade this, but kind of figure out what are the things we have to standardize across the business, put a strategy in place, updating your IT strategy so that you have kind of that, I'll call it managing your assets as part of your IT strategy. So it's not just buying the latest new whiz-bang thing that somebody wants to buy. It's we need a new AI tool that's going to do X, Y, Z, but really focusing on the blocking and tackling of the business and managing risks so that with confidence to your shareholders and look at them and go, you know what, here's our risk, this is what we're going to do, and we have confidence now moving forward. We're not going to run into problems like that airline did that we keep Southwest Airlines we keep talking about. I keep talking about, but I mean, it's recently in the news, and I think people start thinking about that. And so, as a shareholder, you would almost want to, if you're listening to this as a shareholder, you almost want to call up your board and ask them, hey, have you guys done this?
Right. And I think IT is such a hard thing to conceptualize for a lot of people. But when you see examples like what happened at Southwest, it's like, oh, this is how some server box down in this basement can affect me, an end consumer. Examples like that really show how important keeping your systems up to date are.
Well, this is perfect. Lauren, I appreciate you coming on to our Jargon podcast. This has been very educational. And I do think for our listeners out there, if you have any questions or want to just chat with us about how your organization can address this or even start thinking about addressing the risk associated with technical debt and risk associated with, I'll just call it reliability and making sure your infrastructure, your applications, and your data is reliable and effective, feel free to reach out to us at Trinergy. Just go to our website at trinergy.com. Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate you coming out today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.